Welcome, I'm Sarah Wilson. I'm the head of School of Psychological Sciences, and I'm really delighted to see so many of you here tonight at this very important first Psych Talk for the year. Our school runs these Psych Talks. They're a new initiative, and this is the first one for the year, and we're going to focus on the really important topic of eating disorders. And I think we've put together a really scintillating program for you to experience tonight. But I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land, and I would like to pay my respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present here tonight. So tonight we have a wonderful opportunity to talk with our event partners, the Butterfly Foundation. And they are, if you don't know about the Butterfly Foundation, a leading voice in supporting the needs of people experiencing eating disorders and also supporting their carers. And we're going to be hearing from them as part of our panel and hopefully helping you learn more about the lived experience of eating disorder. But we're also pleased to welcome a number of other organisations who are in attendance here tonight and who also do a lot of good work in this space, and that includes Eating Disorders Victoria, Eating Disorders Families Australia, and many others. But most of all, I'd like to say a special welcome to our esteemed moderator and friend of the school. She's run panels like this before, Lynn Malcolm. I'm sure she's familiar to most of you here for her amazing work on All in the Mind, and she's going to be taking us on this journey tonight. So thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everybody. Welcome. I'm excited to be moderating this Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences Psych Talk series on eating disorders. We just want to start though by saying that if any content presented today raises concerns for you or challenges, please feel free to take a break, to leave the room, and you can also have a chat to our psychologist. Just right up the back there, she's got her hand up, and she'll be happy to have a chat with you. We live in a world fixated on how we look and what we eat, and it's no wonder that body dissatisfaction and eating disorders are on the rise. Eating disorders are complex neuropsychiatric disorders affecting all ages, gender identities and cultures. These disorders are not necessarily about thinness, and you can't tell that someone has an eating disorder just by looking at them. With eating disorders having potentially life-threatening consequences, it's clear that research and advocacy for people experiencing eating disorders are needed now more than ever before. And while we're discussing support and treatment for people with eating disorders, it's very relevant to note that there has been a huge systematic change which educators and health professionals should be aware of. In December last year, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and Minister for Health, Greg Hunt, announced the national recognition of eating disorders in Australia's health system. An amendment to the medical benefits scheme will improve access and affordability of appropriate eating disorders treatment in Australia from the beginning of November this year, 2019. So that's good news. Our esteemed panel today includes Danny Rowlands, who's kindly stepped in for Christine Morgan, who sadly was unable to attend tonight. Danny is the National Manager of Prevention Services for the Butterfly Foundation. She works with Australian schools and communities to promote positive body image, raising awareness of the risk and protective factors that contribute to negative body image and eating issues. Scott Griffiths, who is an NH&MRC Early Career Fellow investigating body image and eating disorders. Isabel Krug is an academic with the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences, and she will bring a clinical perspective. And Mitch Doyle, who is a lived experience speaker. He will be sharing his personal journey of an eating disorder. But we'll now be joined by Dr. Scott Griffiths, who's going to give us an overview of the changing face of eating disorders, and we will then move to our panel discussion. So thank you, Scott.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Eating disorders are nominally about food and eating. But if you look more closely, you'll find that eating disorders are tangled in a complex social and cultural web. Eating is just a symptom. Eating disorders are as much about our values and our morals and our societies and the way we treat people within our societies as they are about eating. And because societies have changed over time and because they're still changing, eating disorders are moving targets and they change also. And we can look back in history to get some perspective on this. The first credible English language description of an eating disorder was in 1689 by a physician called Richard Morton. He described two adolescents, one male, one female, who were physically wasting away despite having access to food. And in this and all subsequent accounts of anorexia for the next 250 years, body image and physical appearance were barely mentioned. Rather, anorexia was always described in the context of piousness and as restriction in the service of God. And in 1874, Charles Le Segway and William Gull coined the term we know as anorexia. And here, gender makes its first contribution. The only reason we know of anorexia as anorexia nervosa and not as anorexia hysterica, as it was originally proposed, is because the disorder afflicted men in addition to women, which meant that it got to avoid the hysteria label that was pejoratively applied to all women experiencing psychological distress at the time. And this complex interplay between gender and other societal forces defines eating disorders right throughout until modern times. In 1952 and 1968, 70 years later, we got the DSM-1 and the DSM-2. The DSMs are like psychiatric Bibles. If you walk into a psychologist's office in Australia or North America, then this is a reference text for diagnosing psychological disorders. Anorexia is not recognized as a psychiatric disorder in these texts. Rather, it's listed as a feeding disturbance in a special section right at the end. With no text description, it just says anorexia. And it takes until 1973, a German psychoanalyst called Hilde Bruch, to say, well, no, actually, anorexia is more than just not wanting to eat, and telling people to eat will not solve the disorder. There are complex psychological processes that manifest and maintain this, and if you don't address those, then you won't solve it. And at this time, it's clear that body image and physical appearance is the driving force behind a large number of these diagnoses. In 1979, Gerald Russell comes along and coins the second eating disorder, which is bulimia nervosa. And in this, the cardinal symptoms are binge eating, where you eat a lot of food and you feel out of control whilst doing so, you feel unable to stop, and then purging, which are the compensatory behaviors that happen afterward in an attempt to not absorb those calories. And as with anorexia, body image and appearance pressures are now featuring near universally and are needing to be incorporated into the criteria, which are first published in 1980 in the DSM-3. This is the first time that anorexia and bulimia are recognized as psychiatric disorders. In 1994, we get the DSM-4, and that adds binge eating disorder. So binge eating disorder is distinct from bulimia in that you have the binge eating, but in the absence of those compensatory behaviors. And then in 2013, we get the DSM-5. And there are changes to the diagnostic criteria because it's becoming clear that it's no longer just women suffering from eating disorders. Men are increasingly featuring in eating disorder clinicians' offices. Amenorrhea, the absence of menstruation, was removed as a diagnostic criterion in the DSM-5. And prior to this, if you were a man and you did have anorexia. You couldn't technically be diagnosed with the disorder because of this. And we've also added a number of other eating disorders since then, like rumination disorder and pica. Now, eating disorders are moving targets for many reasons, but for now I just want to maintain the focus on one as a reference point, which is gender. And men and women typically don't covet the same bodies, and we know this because we've asked. Here is data from 2,700 men living in every state and territory of Australia. We asked what their body is now and what the body is that they would ideally like to have for themselves. And it's clear enough that there is a distinction between, a difference between the body that men have and the body that they idealize for themselves. And if we're willing to accept that different people desire different types of bodies in different cultures and different societies, then you're also accepting that the types of dieting and exercise and associated behaviors that make up and manifest an eating disorder will be different also. And this is not a trivial difference. Here is data from men and women diagnosed with anorexia, confirmed by a clinical interview, the same substantive disorder. And these columns represent their scores on the most widely used eating disorder self-report symptom measure in the world. And the difference between men and women on this measure, which purportedly measures the same construct, an eating disorder, is large. It is big. That has huge implications for screening and for research and for clinical work. And this is just one difference. Societies around the world are full of differences. It's not just gender. How many societies have unique eating practices or practices around cooking? All societies do. And unless you ask those questions, unless you question the fundamental assumptions you make about things like measurement, then people are not represented, and we will never catch up to the moving target that is eating disorders. Take gay men, for example. We know that gay men are a high-risk group for eating disorders. They are not well represented in eating disorders research. Less than 0.5% of eating disorders research is on gay men. And it's in part because it's hard to go out and find an appreciable number of gay men to recruit into eating disorders research. But because it's hard is not a reason not to do it. You just need to be creative in how you go about it. So we teamed up with Grindr, a dating app that caters to gay men. And 2 weeks ago, we sent these full-screen smartphone advertisements out to users living nationwide in Canada, Australia, the US, and the UK. And we didn't just send a few, we sent 3.5 million of these. And 2 weeks from now, Gay Bodies Worldwide will be the largest longitudinal study of gay men in the world. And it is not a study of treatments. We are not at the stage of treatments yet. It is a study of our assumptions, of the basic assumptions of measurement and representativeness upon which all treatments are built. And in a decade in which representativeness and inclusion are defining points of a movement that seeks to bring more people into the world and help us understand more things about more people, I think it's important that we do that. And it's not just the face of eating disorders that are changing, it's also the face of eating disorders research. So much is being made about the replication crisis in psychology, about the oftentimes opaque decision-making that goes into creating research outputs and about the biases that are in there. Well, since 2017, all the research coming out of our team has been completely accessible. Everyone in this room can see the questions that we ask. You can see the code that we use to analyze our data. You can see the anonymized data itself. It's the right way forward for a science that seeks to be as open and inclusive and representative as possible. So in summary, the face of eating disorders is changing because eating disorders themselves are changing. They've never been static. They are a moving target that manifests differently in different societies, and these differences are significant in such a way that it demands our attention. The onus is on us to recruit people into studies, to ask the right questions and question our assumptions. Eating disorders research is also changing. We're not interested in fiefdoms, just clear-eyed and credible science that is rigorous and representative. And as Danny will describe shortly, we're also working together as a sector for advocacy, and we're starting to score some serious wins in that department. That's it from me. I hope you find tonight interesting, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Scott. That was so interesting to get that historical context. I think that's really important. I just thought I'd start with you, Mitch. You were first diagnosed with an eating disorder when you were 11 years old. Could you tell us a little bit about what was going on for you then?
Yeah, so, being 11 years old and, kind of having that weight of hating myself is something that I remember quite vividly. I was teased quite often by a group of boys in my school over my weight. I wasn't anywhere near as tall as I am now, so I hadn't filled out. I had what I call my baby weight on me. That became an aim for them. That became a target for them because I wasn't athletic. I didn't like sports. And so they tormented me each and every day. I was fat, I was ugly, I was worthless, I was disgusting. And for me, upon reflection, looking back, what really kind of, fueled the eating disorder was internalizing those kind of beliefs. What they said to me was, I took them in and they became the beliefs that I had about myself. And that fed into a really toxic relationship with food. I never saw food as something that I needed to survive. I made the connection of, okay, well, if I'm fat, there's fat in food, fat equals bad, I won't eat food. Like, it was that simple connection that just seemed to really spiral. And that really took over my eating behavior and exercise behavior. Spiraled into what was, kind of a 14-year thing for me. Yeah.
And your feeling about yourself was so integral to that. You had a poor relationship with food and with your own body.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, again, upon reflection, it was never eating, and the food side of things was the manifestation of something much, much deeper. There was the obsession around food, but when you kind of unpack those layers as to what kind of contributes to it all, there was so much there on self-worth. I didn't have any. There was so much there on lovability. I didn't love myself. I didn't think that I was worthy of love or belonging or connection. So that was really what fueled everything, and eating just seemed to be the way that I could control that, or think that I could control that.
Isabel, you've done a lot of research into appearance comparisons. Could you tell us more about how social media content such as thinspiration, filtered photos and fitspiration is affecting people?
Yeah, so we do know that a lot of young adolescents in Australia, approximately 80%, do use social media platforms, and the most widely used are image-centric platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. And so our research and also other research has actually shown that it's the comparison with the peers rather than maybe the family or the kind of celebrities that is actually important in creating body image concerns, and that's because those images are more attainable and so it's a more likely a comparison for them. And so the problem though is that the people normally upload images that have actually been filtered, so they choose the most attractive images of themselves, or they kind of edit the way they look, so they look better on those images that they present. That's been a cause for eating disorder image concerns in people. And so there's currently two different types of images that are very widespread in the internet, and these are thinspiration and fitspiration, as you just mentioned. For thinspiration, images are actually images that pursue thinness at all means, and so they have actually been around for quite a long time, and those are the images that we normally see on pro-ana websites. A more recent phenomenon is the phenomenon of fitspiration, and those images actually show women engaging in exercise, so a lot of times those images health promoting, but at the same time they also show very lean women, and the problem obviously with those images is that the women compare themselves in a way that they think they can attain this kind of healthy behavior, and so they that also causes body dissatisfaction. And actually research has shown that it's the comparison with the fitspiration images images that causes more body image comparisons rather than inspiration. So they are really an important focus and can be very detrimental.
And Scott, that's very relevant to your research. Can you talk us through your research into muscle dysmorphia?
Sure. So, in the late 1990s, a Harvard professor was doing research on steroid users, and he came across this subset of guys, and they were obsessed with getting more muscular, and they, in every way, shape and form, reminded him of his earlier clinical work with eating disorders when he'd see a lot of clients with anorexia, and that's where the term muscle dysmorphia was coined. And we've sort of picked up on that and tried to look at it in the Australian context. And in a way, it makes sense if you're willing to consider that eating disorders are more than just the stereotype and are moving targets. If the body that you idealize for yourself, the one that you want more than anything else, is lean and muscular as opposed to thin and skinny, then if you have a problem, it orients toward that and it looks differently, and we call that muscle dysmorphia.
So, Isabel, binge eating disorder is defined by regular episodes of binge eating, and it's accompanied by feelings of loss of control and, in many cases, guilt, embarrassment and disgust. Tell us more about this disorder.
Yeah, so as I think actually Scott has been so kind to actually already define binge eating for us and to say that it actually has been added to the DSM-5 very recently, so in 2013. And so it's the newest eating disorder diagnosis that we currently have in the DSM. And the prevalence rates of binge eating disorders is actually higher than the ones of other eating disorders, such as anorexia and bulimia. It's about 1.3% in the population. We do also know that the gender disparity is less pronounced in binge eating. So it's about 40% of binge eating disorder patients are males. And as Scott already outlined, binge eating disorders suffer from binge eating, but they don't engage in compensatory behaviors such as bulimia patients do, which normally includes excessive exercise and purging behavior. Also, a binge eating disorder is often comorbid with overweight and obesity, and therefore they present with a lot of the physical problems that overweight people might present with, such as cardiovascular problems, diabetes, and also fertility problems. And often, binge eating disorder patients might seek treatment, which here the first call of treatment would be a GP, because of these physical problems rather than the psychological problems with the binge eating, because they might be more ambivalent about changing it. And in terms of treatment, we know that cognitive behavior therapy is the first line treatment option for binge eating disorder patients, but there's also other treatment availabilities such as dialectical behavior therapy, which works more with emotion regulation, and also interpersonal therapy that has been shown to be effective.
So it's not as easy to identify. It looks like somebody's overweight. Danny, we're inundated with stories in the media about people discriminating against others about their body weight and size. There's a real weight stigma. Tell us more about that and what needs to change in the way we talk about body shape and size.
Sure. Look, we live in an image-obsessed society where how a person looks has become the most pinnacle of a person and valued amongst most other traits. So with platforms now such as your social media platforms, people feel like they have this right to comment on another person's body or their shape or their size, and that's happening much more intensely than ever before. So, we're seeing people who are being shamed regardless of their body shape, thin shaming and also fat shaming and also fat shaming, which is really intense. But when we look at actually weight stigma, that's a different thing. Weight stigma, is where someone is actually discriminated based on their shape or size. And sadly, that's not just in relation to comments that are being made about their physical shape. There is an assumption about their health. There is assumption about the behaviours that they may engage in. There is so much shaming around how a person presents. And sadly, we're hearing some really sad stories where, it's affecting people's employment opportunities, their study opportunities, relationships where weight stigma is having a place in there. And also, obviously, in relation to healthcare, where we're hearing stories where people just aren't able to access compassionate, non-judgmental supportive care purely based on their size. So what can we do? I think we first of all need to stop making the assumption that we know how healthy a person is based on the way that they look. Nobody is an expert on anybody else's body. And I think we all just need to take check before we make any kind of judgment on another human body, and just stop making those judgments. Let's focus on different values and qualities and attributes. We also really need to consider how we're promoting health. The depiction of the classic stereotype of what's unhealthy and what's healthy is actually just further reinforcing weight stigma and far from helpful. A person's relationship with food, with exercise, with their body is really, really complex. And I think as well, regardless of what shape or size a person is, every single body and person deserves to be able to access support and care in a really non-judgmental way.
Mitch, as you were growing up, could you tell us more about what societal pressures there were on you and how it affected you?
Yeah, I'm thankful that I didn't have to grow up in the age of Instagram at that young age, but there was definitely still a lot of pressure to look a certain way. My brothers were big into sports and I wasn't, so there was automatically that, what am I doing wrong kind of thing. Again, speaking to sports, like for men, where we heavily publicise male athletes, football players, soccer players, whatever it may be, and I just didn't identify with that, so there was that disconnect there for me. But on the side of eating disorders, I didn't have anything to relate to because there was no publicised person to kind of link in with. It was always a tabloid kind of portrayal of a celebrity, a female celebrity at that, and I just didn't feel that there was anything out there that represented the way that I was feeling. And we place a lot of pressure on young people to do things at such a young age, and we don't necessarily let people find themselves and let them kind of explore that for themselves. We're just like, you should do this, you should look like this, you should weigh this, you should eat that. And it's like, where do we draw the line?
So how did you eventually find help?
Well, my parents tricked me into a doctor to start with. I had a flu at the time, and they could see something that was unraveling, and I was just like, no, I'm doing the right thing. This is what I need to do to fit in. This is what I need to do to be popular and to have everyone like me. But they cut right through that, and they took me to a doctor, and the doctor said to me, "Put the weight back on, or you're going to hospital." And that was it. That was at 12 years old. So there was no psychological intervention. There was nothing done there. And that, it scared me out of it for a period of time. It definitely didn't fix the problem. And, it bit back a lot harder when I was 17. And, what kind of spiraled that was I was in a PE class and we were doing BMI tests on each other and fat caliper tongs on each other and weighing each other, and I was the exact same figure that I am now, but it was just something triggered and I was just like a bat out of hell. And then that just spiraled more and more into my early 20s, and I guess what kind of really worked for me was finding a psychologist. I did family-based therapy there for a little while, which was, I don't have fond memories of that. I don't like to talk badly about it, but it definitely wasn't for me. It was kind of, I remember it quite well. They took my parents in for a session, left me in the waiting room for 90 minutes, and they came back out, and it was like they'd given my parents, a license to kill. They were just like, we're going to hit this thing, we're going to hit this thing hard, you're not going to like us. And I was like, what did you do in there? What went on? And then it was I felt very manipulative. It was like, you're going to eat or you're not going to the Pink concert. And I was like, don't bring her into this. All right, I'll eat and it'll put the weight back on, but I'm not going to stop doing it later on. It was very, it didn't address anything that was underneath. And it wasn't until that I found a really great psychologist who never weighed me, or if she did once and she said, look away. The focus was not on food. I don't remember the theme of the sessions being around what did you eat today, how many calories did you consume, what was on your plate. It was around the self-worth. It was around the maladaptive thought patterns that I had. It was untangling the lies that I was telling to myself, and sticking with that. I think we're in an age of you can fix yourself in 12 weeks, in 12 steps, and in a 1-week program. And that's just, if you want to put the work into to kind of get this stuff resolved and to live a life where you actually feel comfortable with yourself, that takes time, and we can't put that into a time frame. It's not something that we can do. It's not realistic.
Yeah, it goes much deeper.
Absolutely.
Scott, what's currently happening to ensure that we raise the profile of male body dissatisfaction?
Well, events like this help a lot, and in some ways I kind of don't even want it to be about male body dissatisfaction in general, as important as it is to focus on males and make sure they're incorporated into the diagnostic criteria. It's increasingly clear that there are huge swaths of the world who are not represented when it comes to campaigns to make people aware of body image and to develop measures that are actually sensitive to their concerns so that we can build treatments that will actually work for them. And really, I think it comes down to events and to advocacy and to being willing to speak to people about these concerns if you have them, to not keeping them bottled up so that people who do harbour them secretly don't feel like they are going to be a pariah if they share them. And if we get to that point when you can talk about your appearance and your concerns and anxieties surrounding that openly and not fear judgment or discrimination on that basis, then we will be a much happier society in general. So please be open, share with your friends, share with people who care about you, and we can start to combat it together.
And is there anything specific about the problem with if men identify as LGBTIQ? Is there anything specific there that is more prominent, or?
Well, as I was saying in the talk, there's some evidence that gay men are a high-risk group, and it's hard to tell if that's because there's something unique about appearance pressures in the gay community, or it's because we just don't know how to conduct adequate research in that space, or because treatment programs haven't penetrated that space, so problems have been allowed to linger and manifest for a longer period of time. But at the very least, studies like Gay Bodies Worldwide are trying to address that in a very public and, to the best extent we can, global sort of way.
So Mitch, the Butterfly Foundation recently launched a program called Reset. It's a digital body image program for males, which you are a part of. How important are programs like this, particularly in the school setting?
I think they're invaluable. It's a resource that really puts stigma on the stage and kind of just calls its bluff. It's a really great resource to actually really remind young boys and young girls at that these issues are not gendered. They know no gender, age, location. It's a free for all, and it's a really great thing to have in the classroom, because that's where a lot of these issues start to develop. And I would have loved to have had something like that at school when I was going to school, but there just wasn't anything like it. And I think what's really great about it is you hear from young boys and you hear from the pressures that they're facing now, and they're different to the pressures that I was facing only 10, 15 years ago. So it's really great, and I think it will be a really great resource for young people in the classroom to identify with, so that they can start to engage in more help-seeking behaviour around things that might be troubling them. Because there is a big stigma around not only eating disorders but mental health a lot in men, and engaging in help-seeking behaviour, and that it's weak to speak and all of this kind of facade. So I think having a resource like that in schools it's really going to be a great asset.
You must have witnessed some fairly inspiring conversations.
Yeah, it's I'm blown away by some of the stories that these young people come out with, and I'm lucky enough to be a sessional presenter with Butterfly and get to go out and hear from young people and all the quirky things that they have to say, and also some really heartbreaking things, like seeing seeing young people from year 3 talking about not being good enough and not being looking something enough or not being strong enough or pretty enough. And that's, I've got 2 very young nephews, and to think that they're already thinking that way, and to see my young nephew who's 5 years old being like, I want to be strong, I want to do push-ups. I'm like, dude, don't do that. Go kick a ball, go fall on your face. Like, be a kid. And here he is being pressured by something. So to hear insight from young people, and we need to listen to that more, because that's where the wealth of knowledge is going to come from. So we need to respect that space and listen to them and work from that.
Mm. Isabel, could you tell us more about gender, or how gender orientation and identity play a role in eating disorders, and why disordered eating is so prevalent in non-binary people?
Yes, of course. I think also Scott already answered the question in a way, but I tried to maybe provide an answer from a slightly different angle. So we do know, even though there's been obviously more recognition of eating disorders in males, we do know that actually female gender is a risk factor for eating disorders. So apart from this biological gender role is also important to consider, and that's actually the construct of a cultural stereotype of what is regarded to be stereotypically feminine or masculine. So the person can provide feminine traits or masculine traits in behaviors or attitudes or the personality. And so gender role orientation is this framework on where somebody locates him or herself on this dimension of femininity or masculinity. And it seems plausible that gender role that are sometimes competing and often contradictory can play a role in eating disorders because they do have an impact on self-esteem and body satisfaction, and obviously these are important psychological elements of eating disorders. And so we do know that people that highly endorse femininity are more likely to endorse drive for thinness and praise more the thin ideal, versus people or individuals that score high on muscularity are more concerned about muscularity, disordered eating symptoms. Scott also referred to that already previously. And in terms of eating disorders affecting more non-binary populations, such as gay men and women, and also transgender people or queer people, Scott also already referred that there is a possibility that there might be high risk for them, and we don't know exactly why. It could potentially be related to this gender role endorsement that I just talked about, and they might actually find it difficult to cope with internal and conflict related to the sexual identity that emerges around puberty, and Mitch referred to that's a very critical period of time, obviously, for the development of an eating disorders. And as Scott referred, it is also possible that maybe the communities, non-binary communities, might place more emphasis on thinness and the physique or muscularity, but we don't really know, because I think there's more research is required in that area. So.
And the body checking behaviour is common throughout all disorders, I think, eating disorders. What can we do to try and keep it positive when we look in the mirror?
Yes, that's a really good question. So, body checking basically is any kind of behavior where we are checking our body, or which could possibly be checking somebody's weight, or constantly going on a scale, or checking our thighs. And it's a good question to ask how we can keep positive about our body image when we look in the mirror. And so there's 4 essential things I think that could be important to take into consideration. Well, first of all, it's important to pay attention to the thoughts that we are having regarding our body, because we are constantly bombarded with negative body images throughout the day, but it's just important to acknowledge those thoughts and to not maybe pay too much attention to them. And that's the practice of mindfulness, and the less emphasis we give on those thoughts, the less influential they will be. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I think it's very important to think about what might be actually causing our body image distress, because it can be something very different. So we could, for instance, have a problem with our partners, and that might be the underlying cause for the body image negative thoughts we might experience when we look at the mirror. So kind of being more critical about the stressors that in that moment are causing body image concerns. The third thing is making is important to be gratitude to oneself. So actually having a gratitude diary, that's very helpful to think really about the positive aspects about our body, and to maybe focus on the body parts that we're happy with. Maybe we like our eyes or we like our hair, and to see emphasize those things in the mirror, and to just say phrases to ourselves such as very thankful for the things that my body is able to do, such as I can use my legs to climb up all the stairs in this in this big room. So having such a gratitude diary and writing that down can be very helpful. And the final thing, which is also part of mindfulness, and is being self-compassionate with somebody, with oneself when looking at the mirror, and acknowledging that we can all have bad days, and that every one of us here has probably experienced those days where we don't like our body, and that's normal. And in those days, maybe trying to be as kind to ourselves as to somebody we would be to somebody that we love, and maybe doing things we enjoy, such as reading a book, or maybe taking a bath, and that's been actually shown to be quite effective in having a positive impact on how we perceive ourselves. So I think those 4 things could be important to take into consideration. But I know it's hard. It's hard to apply it. Yeah.
So Mitch, you have used yoga, haven't you? Tell us about how you've used yoga to help you through the dark space that you've been through.
Yeah, and once again, it was something that someone dragged me along to at one point. But thankfully, he did. One of my good friends, he took me to a class, and there was something in it that really just sparked an awareness in me that I'd never really had. Like, you know, I love to run, and I've been to the gym before, but I hate going to the gym now. And what really kind of struck me about yoga was that it was never a do it, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to do all of these things. It was just go where you go today, and that's exactly where you go. I mean, yoga has kind of been bastardized in the modern Western world now to like booty yoga and Beyonce yoga and all that kind of stuff, so stay away from that. But at the essence, it's really about connecting your body back with your mind, and being present in the moment. And some of my favorite teachers have said, look, you're going to get into one pose one day, and it's not going to be, you're never going to get into the same pose twice. You're never going to feel that same way again, because the pose will be different each time. So knowing that your body is not a static state, it was like, oh, you know, this is actually, I grow, I move, you know, I'm quite dynamic. It was not a regimented, militant thing like going to the gym or something like that. And going to the gym works for a lot of people, but for my mind, it was very hard to go to the gym because it was very that militant, very controlling. Whereas yoga, it's like you get on the mat, and hey, you might get on the mat, do a couple of asanas, and then cry for 5 minutes, and then it's like, cool, great, class done. So it's about really reconnecting back with yourself, and speaking to that mindfulness aspect of things. You know, slowing down and not, and just tapping into what's really going on for you at the moment was something that was really really helpful for me. It was really the space where I stopped being at war with my body and just being like, oh, you're who you are, and that's rocket. Yeah.
So self-management, obviously self-management and also treatment is very personalised. Danny, can you just talk us through some of the myriad of treatments that are available and what's effective?
So the reality with treatment is what works for one person may not necessarily work for somebody else. And so what we do encourage is obviously seeking out the most evidence-based treatment that you can find, but we also respect that in some cases that doesn't always work. So finding, you know, Mitch is an example of, you know, speaking to different people along the way, and then having that person that really got you and got eating disorders. I think is really important. So we really as well encourage from Butterfly's perspective is that disciplinary approach. So ensuring that you have people kind of covering lots of different aspects in relation to your treatment and your care. We also appreciate that that is expensive, and so hopefully finding tools and practitioners that can work within your budget so that you're not discriminated against really good care is really important. So, there are so many different psychological and different treatment practices that I'm not a clinician, so I won't talk to all of those, but, you can find information about the different types like cognitive behavioural therapy, family-based therapy, psychological support. But then also there's all the complementary therapies that really support full recovery, which is your mindfulness, which is your acceptance commitment therapy. All lots of different approaches that can really help somebody not only manage and recover, but then take their recovery to a place where they really are free from their eating disorder.
Isabel, when somebody presents in the clinic for treatment, what happens if the person is really resistant and just doesn't really want to seek help and is resistant to that?
Yes, that's a very good question. So I think there's two different levels where a person might present and maybe not wanting to engage in treatment. So the first one is where actually the person might have already seen potentially a GP, and that GP has been referring that person on to a specialized eating disorder treatment, and that instance then the person maybe refuses to engage in the treatment. And so what we normally do in the clinic is to actually spend quite a bit of sessions trying to do cognitive motivational therapy, which actually kind of targets a little bit this ambivalence about wanting to change, because at that stage the patients might be in a pre-contemplation stage where they're not even thinking about change, and through the right methods and reflective listening and understanding and empathy, we try to move them towards this contemplation stage where they are already thinking about this active change and can then engage in the treatment that is provided at the clinic. And obviously the harder other kind of possibility is that a person might not even seek that initial help, so might not even present to an eating disorder clinic. And in that instance, it can be very difficult. And it's mainly often, as I think it was also in your case, that family members or friends that actually notice that there might be a problem, and they might actually speak up to the affected person and encourage them to seek treatment, which is very important to have that conversation, even though it can sometimes be very difficult. And often eating disorder patients actually might be quite happy for a family member to actually start that conversations, because they might be afraid to ask for help, or they might maybe have low self-worth to think that they kind of are kind of deserving that help. So it's very important to do that. But I think also it's important to be aware that there could be denial and rejections in the beginning, and to kind of still nevertheless provide the support for the person and let them know that you're there, and to potentially also provide maybe some self-help guides where they can maybe read about kind of what could help them in their recovery. It's not as effective as treatment-based that is led by a health professional, but it could be a first step, and maybe providing them with the right contact details, such as Butterfly Foundation or Eating Disorder Victorious, is also very helpful.
So Danny, the Butterfly Foundation does a lot of work in this space, in the recovery space. Yeah,
we do. And I think with eating disorders, what we really kind of can't stress enough is that early intervention is really key. So one of the most important thing is that when any kind of thinking starts to become a little bit disordered in relation to our body shape or our eating habits or behaviours or our exercise, that we really recognise that as not being, for want of a better word, the healthy way to be, I guess, thinking, which is really tricky in the world that we live in. But early intervention at that early stage is really key, because the longer somebody waits to access treatment, then the more difficult the whole recovery process can be. But through the Butterfly Foundation, we have the Butterfly National Helpline. So that is operated with trained professionals. It's a confidential and free service. It runs from 8 a.m. to midnight, 7 days a week. That was extended last year, and we've seen a huge increase in the number of calls as a result of those changes. So for anyone, whether it be an educator, whether it be a clinician, whether it be a person themselves, a parent, anyone who is just concerned about somebody or themselves, we really encourage people to contact the National Helpline and have a conversation with the people on the other end. You'll be anonymous, and it's just a way for you to start that conversation, which can hopefully encourage those important steps towards recovery. We also have intensive outpatient programs. They run out of our Sydney office, the Sydney office, but they are national service available. We also have a range of recovery support groups and that run around at the moment around the country, and that's in conjunction with primary health networks and also local headspace groups. But we also, look at recovery from a very holistic perspective. So from the prevention perspective, we can go into schools and we can talk to obviously teachers about what's happening in relation to eating disorders so they know how to support someone. In relation to friends, we can obviously provide that support as well, which I think is really key. And we also have carer support online workshops and can also direct carers to further training, information, resources, so that they're really equipped to help the people that they love.
Lots of resources there.
Yeah.
So for any parents or teachers that are in the audience that are watching young people, are there just some key, simple red flags to look out for?
Eating disorders, I guess, are mental illnesses. So I think we need to be. There aren't just one thing that's going to be the red flag for you. I think when it comes to parents, absolutely trust your instinct. If you're noticing your child's behaviour around food, exercise, their body image, the behaviours, how they're engaging or disengaging from sports, activities, schools, friendships, if they're perhaps presenting with some other mental health concerns, to really consider that perhaps an eating disorder could also be a part of that. I think too often we just assume that an eating disorder is going to present in a very typical way, that they'll be a female, they'll be Western, they'll be young, and that's what they look like. But we know that eating disorders, you cannot always tell, as you said earlier, just by looking at somebody what they may look like. So we really do encourage parents just to trust your instinct. And if you take your child to a health professional who perhaps doesn't give you the response that you think, and that gut is still is just keep going to find that support. And obviously the Butterfly National Helpline can help. From an educator perspective, educators will see and teachers will see young people in a very different setting, and they will be seeing some changes that may present with young people. But we also know that friends are often the first people to identify, and they'll come to a teacher and say, I'm concerned about this person. And I think any concern that someone raises in relation to a person and their eating and exercise and even body image issues is to really be taken seriously, and that goes with a person saying, this is how I'm feeling, is not to shut it down and to really ensure that we listen and we're open to what happens. But we really encourage people to be informed and to find information. From a warning sign perspective, the National Eating Disorder Collaboration, which is nedc.com.au, has an incredible amount of resources for professionals, for clinicians, for educators, for people themselves, for parents, and it's a really fantastic resource to access loads of information, and there's some other fantastic sites that parents can access and educators can access too.
And Scott, one quite a dangerous factor probably is the pro-ANA websites. How can parents and carers help with those or counter the negative influence of those?
Those are really tricky.
Yeah.
For context, there's websites on the internet where individuals who are in the throes of an eating disorder and are not at a place where they're ready to seek treatment congregate, and it becomes this sort of reinforcing positive place to stay within the eating disorder, because a lot of the attitudes and beliefs that manifest as an eating disorder are held by society at large. It's really hard to pull away and divest from those. And given what those communities represent, which is like a source of social support when everyone around you is telling you that things are not going well, and they'll stay there and say that actually no, you're doing fine, is to be that support for them, even as they're pulling away or things are getting difficult, and remind them that you are there no matter what. I wouldn't recommend anything like trying to cut off access to internet. That not once have I seen that work in a positive way. More passive sort of staying there and being supportive approaches seem to work in that specific instance.
And we know also that there are a lot of adults, it's not just young people, there are a lot of adults diagnosed with eating disorders. Are they harder to look out for?
Yeah. I think adults in general are perhaps better at concealing the fact that they are suffering from an eating disorder, or if they are parents themselves, they're extremely reluctant to let it be known, to say their kids that they're suffering from an eating disorder. For a long time, we didn't think that eating disorders would affect men and women in the later stages of their life, and then we bothered to ask, and what do you know they do? Why wouldn't they? They live in the same world we all live in that compels people to look certain ways and to express having a sense of having themselves put together and having their stuff under control by managing their body weight. Adults are as welcome at the Butterfly Foundation and to call that helpline. And I think sometimes adults feel that eating disorders are a young person's game and that the support services aren't really for them, and nothing could be further from the truth. Those professionals know exactly how to talk to you, and I'd encourage anyone who is older or who cares for someone or who is older to avail themselves of those resources, because even if you had it for a long time, you can still get over it. You can get to that place of recovery and start to live your life on your own terms again.
It's shocking to think that eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric illness. Isabel, what can our government do to help reduce this unacceptable number?
That's a very good question, and there's a lot that the government could do, and I could probably continue talking about this for a very long time, so I'll probably just try to keep it very brief and just to the main points. I think in the last months the government has actually already done quite a lot. So you already referred to the increase in the Medicare rebated sessions that individuals with eating problems will receive from November this year onwards. So instead of the 10 sessions that we normally get, people with eating disorders will get 40 sessions that are psychotherapy based, and another 20 sessions that might be dietary counseling. So that's another 60 sessions, which is very good. I think also the government has already kind of put eating disorder more in the spotlight. So that's why we're having the talk today. And also it's become more pronounced in the media. And the recent call for the Medical Research Future Fund has been placed with a specific focus also on eating disorders. So there will be a lot more funding coming through for eating disorders, and I think also Butterfly Foundation seems like also has received quite a bit of support there as well, if I'm correct with that understanding. And so, yeah, so that's already something that the government has been doing. However, I've been in Australia now for 7 years. I worked previously abroad and in Europe, and in the 7 years, this is actually the very first time I've seen this. So there hasn't been any kind of special calls previously, no specific research towards eating disorders, funding. So I think that really needs to continue on a regular basis and not just a one-off thing. In terms of prevention, I do think that there needs to be a bit more prevention in the social media area, because we've just talked about that, and kind of having media literacy prevention programs, and there's quite a lot of them already around. In terms of treatment, actually when I came to Australia, I was very surprised when I went to clinical eating disorder unit to actually just see the very severe end of the spectrum there. So it seems like just people that are very, very unwell do get this access. And when I talked to clinicians, they actually said that they've asked for funding to incorporate specific groups within their clinic various times, but they have not been successful, such as specific groups for bulimia or outpatient groups also for binge eating disorder, which is the new eating disorder diagnosis. So I think there needs to be a more treatment provision within eating disorder centers across the spectrum, and not just at the very end of the spectrum. So yeah, I think those are probably one of the major things, but there would be lots of other things probably to mention. So.
And Scott, I know that you've done a lot of thinking about prevention. Treatment's very important, but prevention is key. And you've also talked about it as a moral issue. Just tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I mean, the moral issue is that you can't compel people to care so much about their appearance and then turn around and call them vain for it and not offer services when they succumb to the very thing that you pressure them on. It seems so manifestly unkind. And weight stigma is similar as far as I'm concerned. The level of socially acceptable teasing and unkindness that we deliver to people in larger bodies just seems abhorrent to me in a society that contends itself to be a meritocracy and that doesn't judge people based on those things. I think the fact that eating disorders were for a very long time and to some degree stereotyped as concerns that only women and young girls get is what has led to them being underfunded for so long and in part so easy to dismiss. And given the big cultural moment we're having now, we're realising that, you know, gender is this fundamental intrinsic thing in our societies and that we have to do more to elevate and spotlight, then absolutely it's a moral obligation for us to do more in this space. And with respect to prevention, at the coalface, when it's at an individual level and you're trying to prevent an eating disorder from developing, it's you as that person who's not sure if what you have is an eating disorder or if it's severe enough or if you could actually call it that, calling the Butterfly Foundation or at least talking to someone to get that perspective, to get an outside voice that is not the one in your head, because that one can be the most unkind in eating disorders. It often can. And that alone, that one decision there is probably the best investment you could make for your mental health with respect to eating disorders, because if you can stop it from developing in full, then you're living life on your own terms from that point.
So before we go to questions, Mitch, I just wonder if you would like to have some final words. What would you like to say to the audience?
I think everyone can start to help us to continue that conversation and to further propel change in this space. First thing you can do is unfollow anything to do with the Kardashians. But I think everyone in this room really has the power to, help shake and rattle the cages of stigma around eating disorders by just having simple conversations with people in your life. Go home tonight and say, hey, I listened to a really interesting talk. And maybe you'll be passing on some information to someone who really needs to hear it. Or maybe they can pass that on to someone who really needs to hear it. So if we can start to have more open conversations around the stigma that really prevents people from reaching out for help or feeling the shame around reaching out for help, then, it's just a simple conversation. For me, that's where recovery started, was saying to someone that I love, my family, I need help. And 3 simple words was, what really started to put me on the journey of recovery. So I think everyone has the power to do that and not be afraid to have those conversations around these things that we're not too sure of, and ask questions, because they are complex things and we need to be able to feel comfortable to reach out for the support that we need or ask the questions that need to be answered, so that you can either help yourself or help others. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Mitch. All right, so let's go to you, the audience, and if you can just raise your hand and okay, just this lady here with the red cardigan. A bit of mic wrangling to do, but...
Maya, I've got 2 quick questions. One is about the causes and one is about the treatment responses. In relation to the causes, we've talked a bit about that there's multiple factors that cause eating disorders. Some of them are societal, like focus on body image and so on, and then some of them are more individual. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the the genetic contributors to eating disorders, and what we know about that at the moment, about the influence of genes, one's genes. In relation to the treatment responses, from a personal experience, I feel that the treatment required is often extremely complex, maybe more than what's sort of come across at the moment. So, for example, when you start treatment, you might need to first understand why you developed the illness. That's quite useful to sort of go back into what sort of maybe triggered it and caused it. Then you might sort of you talked about developing self-worth, which is really often at the core of what you need, and then the longer that you might be ill, the more you might have isolated yourself, which causes another layer of problems that you need to work through. And then finally, even when you've done all of that, you still are stuck with an eating disorder just because of the habits that have just developed and have become so ingrained that even if you have a sense of self-worth and you no longer feel at a deep emotional level that you need to punish yourself by not eating, that you still maintain these really unhealthy eating habits just because they've become so ingrained. So I guess I'd be interested in your perspective on that level of complexity sometimes that's required in treatment, particularly the longer that you are ill.
Who's up for that one?
The first one is the genetic question, right? So that's, to answer that maybe first. There's quite a bit of research on the genetics of eating disorders. It's, as we all know, there's a biological risk factors implicated in eating disorders as well. And we do know that from twin studies, so we do know that eating disorders are heritable. And so about, I would say, it's hard to put an estimate, but maybe about 50 to 60% is heritable. And we also have seen that eating disorders run in families. So it's likely that if you present with an eating disorder, somebody else in your family might have an eating disorder, or maybe in other mental health problems. We don't know yet exactly which gene is implicated in eating disorders. That'd be wonderful to know, because then you could find a drug and it'd be all kind of solved, but that's not the case, obviously. But we do know that there are risk genes, so those risk genes have been assessed, and it looks like there could be potentially some people with those risk genes that might be more prone to develop an eating disorder if they are also in an environment that triggers the eating disorder. That's called a gene-environment interaction. And Vanya up there, who's actually the psychologist today, she has done her PhD on gene-environment interactions, so she knows all about it. You can ask her questions about it afterwards. And so the more recent line of research is on genome-wise association studies, and that's where we actually analyze the whole human genome and see whether we can identify new novel genes that are implicated in eating disorders. For that, you need very, very large sample sizes, and at the moment, I think sample size about in the 5,000, 6,000 have actually been put together with collaborations from all around the world. But we haven't yet found a specific hit for specific genes. So there needs to be more higher sample sizes to be able to find those genes. So I think that's probably where the research within the genetic research is currently at, and it's progressing very quickly, as you know, also for other mental health illnesses. In terms of, I don't know, the second question, the complexity of chronic, I don't know if I understood the question correctly. Is it, what do you do with a person that has suffered from an eating disorder for many, many years, has tried many, many interventions, and is still not completely recovered? Is that the question, if I summarize it correctly? Or?
More that, you've sort of done you've changed how you emotionally feel about yourself, and you have a sense of self-worth, so you've sort of done that work. But sometimes at a very practical level, the habits sort of still are very difficult to shift, and I wonder whether you've seen that, and whether you have any thoughts on how you do that.
The habits in terms of eating, is that?
There's still disordered eating, and I guess to an extent it's sort of like a safety net because of that fear that because I've resisted for so long that once I start eating, I will be out of control. So in your mind, you feel healthy, but that fear is so intense that you don't know how to eat normally.
Mm-hmm.
Danny?
I had a lived experience as well. So I, from a response to that, recovery is a very individual thing. So where somebody pitches their recovery is entirely up to them. So if they see that as managing their behaviours and that's allowing them to still live their life, then that is what recovery means to them. From my perspective, for me, that was not, I wanted to break free from all of that. And to be honest, the food and habits, so to speak, were really the last thing to change. And the only way that they changed was by challenging each and every single one. So it started with perhaps the ones that seemed a little bit more simple and just confronting that fear head on. And the reality is that fear around food or not exercising or whatever else it might be that you're engaging in can be downright petrifying by not doing it. But it's what will happen if I don't do this, or what will happen if I eat this, and you just see and you trust and you learn to trust your body and you learn to trust yourself, and you start to flip those really unhelpful beliefs of what the eating disorder has ingrained in you on its head. And the only way to do that is to actually give it a go and just take that. I remember being told, just take a leap of faith, just give it a go and see what happens. And you know what? The world didn't collapse. And the people I loved, nothing happened to them. And there were and it was this constant then, this building of evidence that allowed me to see that, okay, it is this mindset that is so unhelpful and unhealthy that is not helping me, and to really challenge those. But it's just every single unhelpful, unhealthy behaviour, habit, thought, and just absolutely confronting it.
Mitch, can you relate to that?
Yeah, CBT for the win. I think I can definitely echo what Danny has spoken about in terms of recovery. It is very individual, and that's what we've kind of spoken a little bit about tonight, is finding what works for you, and not putting recovery into one box, a check box, because it is different for everyone, and challenging those thoughts. And they still pop up every now and then for me. Something like, I want to go eat the chocolate, and my brain says, don't eat the chocolate, so I'll eat 2 chocolates and be like, screw you. So it's about kind of incorporating that nothing bad is going to happen and the world isn't going to end if I eat chocolate or if I don't go for a run or anything like that. It's really about listening to what is good for your body, what is helpful for your body, and nourishing that and respecting that. And something that my psychologist said to me, and they've always got their one-liner psychologists, that one of them was just, a thought is just a thought. And I was like, whoa, that's profound.
That's big.
If only I knew that. But we can start to practice that, not engaging with those kind of thoughts, and just realizing, okay, just let it pass by. It's going to have its airtime, and it's probably going to get a little bit narky, but then it's going to go away. Like nothing will last forever.
Great. Questions? Oh, just down here in the black shirt. Here.
Hi, so I'm also a lived experience speaker with a few organisations, and do some online mental health advocacy. And when the Medicare benefit scheme was announced, there was a lot of talk around what that would entail, and we've talked a lot about managing eating disorders across the spectrum and not just at that sort of very severe like in the hospital system and all that. But then in the media releases for that Medicare benefit scheme, the words severe and complex sort of made their way in. And I'm wondering if any of you have any idea as to what that entails, as to at what point do you allow access to that program, and then also at what point are you too recovered to continue that access?
Do you know much about this? Do you want to go on?
As part of the group that does a lot of professional work in this space, the Australian-New Zealand Academy of Eating Disorders, we take umbrage with that language, severe and enduring anorexia, because I'm yet to meet someone with anorexia for whom it hasn't been severe, enduring or complex or any of these synonyms. And it's part of the government's attempt to carve out a smaller allotment of funding that can go there. And if you're seeing it in media releases, it is something that we are fighting against, because as far as we're concerned, it should include everyone who is suffering from an eating disorder, and not just anorexia for that matter, for the entire spectrum. And yeah, we are aware of it, and we're on the case as much as we can.
I believe it had been extended to bulimia nervosa as well as a diagnoser, and also binge eating disorder. But it is also open to interpretation. I think the who can access and how that can be accessed.
Sort of more like anorexia is sort of automatically covered, but then the other diagnoses, there's a couple of things that I've heard in amongst the works, is that anorexia being the most severe eating disorder is getting all the attention because it perhaps visually comes across very severe typically.
Yeah, and there may be more as a result of the presentation that more people will access help because they have anorexia, and it becomes a physical stability thing, something around medical requiring that intervention. People who perhaps aren't as forthcoming who are experiencing bulimia nervosa or binge eating disorder, so it may just be the prevalence of the fact that there are higher presentations of anorexia in a health setting, so to speak. But from my understanding, it is that it's open to interpretation. It's available for people with eating disorders, and the severe and complex is the open to interpretation thing, as Scott said, because anyone experiencing an eating disorder is entitled to that support.
Yeah, and my understanding also is that it's the GP actually that is the person that actually provides you with the mental health plan. So it really depends if you really want to, as a person with an eating disorder, want to get that access to those 60 sessions, that it would be important to, if the GP is not already educated about eating disorders, which I think is another thing that I would probably put on one of the things that the government should do, is to adequately train the first line of treatment access in the country appropriately to diagnose eating disorder correctly, not just anorexia, but across the spectrum. Right. So I think it's very important to there actually present with the severity and the complexity of the symptoms that one is presenting with, and they then provide you with the accessible care.
Thank you. Another question right up the back with the glasses up the back.
You'll have to forgive me, I'm overcoming a cold. As part of healthcare training, often weight is associated with a level of health, which is how that, I suppose, our messages come out into the public. And it's very deep in the literature and studies, and it's a normal part of practice for many. As we've discussed tonight, weight stigma and discussions around weight can impact one's relationship with food and body image. Do you have, as more of an imaginative question, I guess, do you have any recommendations or propositions to change that form of practice, or train the next generation of medical practitioners, dietitians, physios around the harms of that, and how to sort of adjust practice according to, I suppose, weight, and how to change that? Big question, I'm sorry.
Scott?
In brief, we do it by calling people out. It can happen in the small conversations. If someone makes a comment that implies weight stigma, then addressing it and calling it out for what it is in that moment. And I think if everyone were to start doing that, as opposed to us coming in as eating disorder professionals and, as they'll interpret, cajoling them not to do it, we will get a lot further. But we are doing that cajoling as best we can. But I just get that sense that in certain sectors where weight stigma is very ingrained, where the sense that people in larger bodies are the be-all and end-all of the problem manifest, and they actually need this stigmatization to compel them, to motivate them to want to lose weight, we're not going to get in there anytime soon. And I think people being champions who are in those areas or who know people like that and having those conversations will help.
Question over here in the black. Yep.
Hi, my name is Christine Naismith. I'm a parent of 2 girls with eating disorders. And I'm also one of the founders of an organisation called Eating Disorders Families Australia, which is a support organisation for parents and carers. So I want to say thank you, Danny, for raising the issue about parents know their children best. and to trust a parent's instinct. And I'd just like to reiterate that it's really important that clinicians listen to the parent, because the parent does know their child best. We're now seeing kids at 7 and 8 years of age coming through with eating disorders, anorexia. It's pretty frightening. And the parents are absolutely beside themselves, and they go to the GP, and the GP might say, oh, let's see how they go in a month, or they'll grow out of it or something like that. So I also just want to let people know about a website that's very helpful for early diagnosis. It's called feedyouриnstinct.com.au, and it's an online questionnaire for parents and carers, and they can answer the questions about their child, print out the results. It gives you a traffic light warning of how serious the symptoms are, and you print out a list of tests for the doctor to do, because what we're finding is a lot of GPs aren't properly trained in eating disorders, and this gives the parents the power to say, there is something wrong with my kid, don't fob me off, don't make me wait, so please follow up on these tests. So I just thought I'd mention that website for everybody.
Yeah, it's an
Thank you.
excellent website.
I think it's just down here in the black shirt, man here. Oh, wait for the mic. Yeah.
Because eating disorders, or what we know about eating disorders, is a relatively new field. In terms of the statement, eating disorders are on the rise, and in particular to food restriction and sort of the more traditional notions of eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia. What does it mean specifically by on the rise? Does it mean more people are coming forward, or does it mean that there are more cases, as in with, we can see with more physical disorders and infectious diseases and stuff that are a bit free from stigma, like chicken pox, we can sort of gauge, okay, there's less people or there's more people with this. What does it actually mean by on the rise, and how do you accurately measure that? I often hear social media as a reason and stuff like that, but it seems that neglect of these disorders is decreasing, in that there's more foundations, there's more research, there's a cultural shift, more therapy and whatnot. Yet for some reason, you're also hearing this narrative at the same time that it's heavily on the rise. How do we, from a researcher's perspective, what is the technicalities of that?
Oh, that's actually quite looking at prevalence rates to see, whether they have actually increased or not. I'd actually say, I don't know, it might be, other people might maybe have a different opinion. I personally don't maybe think that they're on the rise, because prevalence rates studies have actually shown that the rates are more or less stable. But I do think that we are better at recognizing them, and I think more populations that previously didn't seek treatment are seeking treatment, because there's more conversation about eating disorders, and it's more in the media, and people are more educated about it. So I think that's probably what is being meant with being on the rise. But I don't know if you have another idea, because I think that might have been somehow the title of your talk. It was a bit on the rise. Yeah.
Your questions are...
Increasing, yeah.
Well, disentangling that in prevalence studies is always hard. And Australia has lacked a genuine longitudinal study that could give us answers like that, but which we're hoping we will be able to do once the big Million Minds funding round concludes, hopefully in our favour. If you look at the segments of the population for whom representation hasn't been there in eating disorders, then the evidence there of increases is much more convincing. And a lot of these sources of evidence are indirect, but they're very useful. Take anabolic steroids, for example, drugs you can inject into yourself to make your muscles grow bigger. We have needle and syringe programs all around this country. If you want to inject drugs, you walk into one of these places and we will give you free injecting equipment. It's a great service. It prevents the spread of bloodborne viruses. We just ask you, what was the last thing you injected? And between 2005 and now, the proportion of individuals who said, hey, the last thing I injected was steroids, went from about 0.2% to 11% nationally. And for the past 6 or 7 years, anabolic steroids have been the #1 drug injected by new injection drug users in this country. It's not methamphetamine, it's not ice, it's nothing like that, it's anabolic steroids. We know half of our guys with muscle dysmorphia inject anabolic steroids. And unless we have a massive surplus of wannabe athletes about to come in to the fore, there is just no way to think that it's anything but that. And it accords with the data that we're seeing in the United States and the United Kingdom as well. Steroid seizures are also way up. And it's these less well-represented populations for which we're just much surer that something to do with physical appearance and the manifestations of eating disorders that surround that are getting worse. They are, of course, indirect. Research is limited in so many ways, but I would say, given what we do know, that eating disorders are increasing in prevalence, and particularly for those who are underrepresented.
Okay, thank you, Scott. And I think we're going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry. I'm sure there are so many other questions, but I think there'll be more on the website for you. But before we go, so I'd like to just put our hands together for our wonderful panel. Thank you. And lastly, we have one more surprise for you before you go. Scott, please take it away.
Come on,
Okay.
Dan.
Oh, I'm attached.
So the experience of participating in eating disorders research has tended to be that, you sign a consent form and then you tell intimate things about your life and about your appearance, about your eating and your well-being, and you never really see the researchers again. But we've moved over to a different model as of last year, where if you participate in our research and you tell us what's going on with you, then you get to donate to an eating disorders charity, and we will pay that donation on your behalf. And I'm glad to say that Butterfly Foundation was the overwhelming recipient of those donations. Last year we ran a study called Closing the Gap. It was about getting people who don't know if they have an eating disorder from that point to the point of accessing treatment. It ran for 9 months. We're analysing the data now. But we have a $1,000 check from the participants of that study, and compel everyone to please participate in eating disorders research and help the sector.
Thank you so much. That's amazing. Thank you.